right, welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, and on this month's episodes, we are going to be talking about voting and elections, since we have the November elections coming up. And joined with me today in the studio is a community organizer who has been working with the Judge Accountability Table. They are a coalition of groups and organizations here in Philadelphia that are working to make change on how we view and understand the judges in our judicial system. Their mission is the criminal justice system targets poor and working class minorities. The Judge Accountability Table aims to address the tough on crime mentality. Judges are the final decision makers in the courtroom, and they should be fair and just. The Judge Accountability Table demands these necessary changes to the judicial system. So they're looking at things like rehabilitation, not retribution, probation and parole reform. Bail is a pre-trial system that must be abolished and not replaced with open-air surveillance, getting ICE out of the courts, decriminalization of sex work and drug use, and making Philly a model for fairness. I want to welcome Devron Washington to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with our listeners. Of course, we have elections coming up in November in just a few weeks, and many folks will get to the polls and they will forget to do their homework or not realize that all these judges are on the ballot. And here in Pennsylvania, judges are elected. In states like New Jersey, they're appointed. And then folks find themselves finding it very difficult to make those selections. So the Judge Accountability Table platform is here to raise awareness and engage people in the process, and I guess let people know more about the significant role that judges play in our criminal justice process.
Yeah, I think our platform, for one, is just a list, like a criteria of what we look at when we're saying like an accountable judge, a kind of guide to help voters determine which judge will actually make a good impact while on the bench. But another huge piece of our work is actually getting access to data and making that available for the voters who have to make a decision. As it stands, since over 100 years, not many judges have been cast out during the retention process. I guess I should back up and say that, so for the Court of Common Pleas judges, they are on the bench for about 10 years. That's how long their term is. And the municipal court judges are on the bench for 6 years. And so once that their term is up, they're up for a retention vote. And so for us, it's kind of crazy that in the history of retention votes in Philadelphia, there has been about one or maybe two, I think it's just one judge that has been ousted in the retention vote. And that's not indicative of like a history of judges that are just stellar on everything. It actually shows us that the voting public does not have access to the information that they need to be able to make a determination of whether or not a judge is qualified or has the record that would warrant them staying on the bench. And then also too, in just electing judges, there's not enough information for us to really make a true decision about who is actually qualified. So in the primary election, that's why we thought it was important for us to create that platform, because it gave voters a way of like testing the candidates of like, who do we want to put on the bench? Who will advance the decriminalization that's going on in Philadelphia right now? And now we've pivoted to trying to get the information and make that public and aggregate it in some way for the voting public.
Excellent. So I want to back up a little bit and just kind of give like a big picture overview of the role that judges play, right? Because some might think, oh, well, I haven't committed any crimes. I don't plan to. But, there's so many different ways that you can find yourself in front of the judge. I think one of the most common ways is like custody cases, right? Like family court, you might have to go to court for visitation rights, custody, etc. Divorce court, right? I hate to say it, but people find themselves getting divorced. Estate settlements, right? Like if you are inheriting something, or a family member that is executor of an estate, and you find yourself battling with family members, you can get sued, or you can sue. Those are all the different ways that you can wind up in court without, quote unquote, being, charged with a crime. And all those judges play an important role, right, on the outcome. And I guess we got to frame it for the listeners. Would you want to be in front of a judge who has a record of being unfair?
Right. I mean, and even what's even scarier is like when you're in front of a judge, you have no clue of that record, right? And I mean, the way I think about it is judges have the ability to take your children. They have the ability to take your freedom. They can take your house. There is an interesting court case. I believe it's going to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania regarding, judges taking people's homes and giving them to investors, which is just, it's interesting. But the public would never know about this because we don't have any reporting requirements for judges, and the judicial system in and of itself is it's self-regulated, right? So you have to step in and go to the Supreme Court in order for you to interject and make any change locally if it's not going to happen through like a retention vote. A really good example of this is the court case that the First Judicial District, which is like the managing office that holds the Philadelphia's court system. So the ACLU is suing the First Judicial District over its use, sued the First Judicial District over its use of cash bail and its bail practices. Now, Philadelphia has been under bail reform and like decarceration, the act of reducing the prison population for the past, maybe 5 years. And luckily we've been able to halve our jail population. But a lot of the reforms that the community is pushing for is being held up by the First Judicial District, right? And that means that the only way that the community has a way of directly shaping what the First Judicial District looks like is through the election process, right? So we're looking to elect accountable judges, and the Judge Accountability Table is really working to make that a reality so that we can, continue the progress that the community has been fighting for. I mean, we've gone through the election of Larry Krasner. We've gone through, working with the MacArthur Foundation to reduce the prison population. And now everything is riding on, right now, kind of what the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania says and instructs or finds in their investigation of the First Judicial District. And we think that power should be in the community's hands.
Yeah, it's really important to be engaged and involved in this process because it really affects everything, Again, like the amount of years a judge sentenced somebody to prison means taxpayers have to pay for that, right? So if nothing else, right, like people are often moved by financial arguments, but also sort of the precedents that are set by these important cases, right, and how subsequent cases are then ruled upon. One of the other things that we talked about when we were interviewing the chancellor of the Philadelphia Bar Association back when we had the primaries was that, we talked about there being a lack of diversity with the judges, and the judges not necessarily being reflective of the population here in Philadelphia, which is another reason why we need to be openly active and engaged in making sure that judges who reflect us, our demographics at the very least, are in those positions of power.
Right. I mean, there's two things there, and I want to just take a second to go back to a point that you made in regard to the judge's ability to, I believe you said, incarcerate someone and charge, and it costs the public a lot of money. The second half of that is that once someone is incarcerated with a felony, they have a record that echoes throughout their their lifetime and their ability to make money. We know that the amount of time down to the day that you spend in jail reduces the amount of money that you're able to make over a lifetime. And also it hurts your children's ability, because your ability to make money also affects your children's ability to take advantage of opportunities and possibly the education that they may receive. And so it really does snowball into like systemic racism, systemic inequality, and generational poverty. And then jumping forward to the current point that you made, and if you could remind me of that real fast, I'm sorry.
No, that there's not a lot of diversity, right? Like Philadelphia is primarily a people of color city, right? Most of the demographic here are Black and Latinx, and we don't necessarily see a lot of women. We don't see a lot of people of color. We don't see a lot of LGBT people who are visible in those roles. And that, I feel, affects the institutional racism and, sexism and other things when applying these sentences or these rulings. And we see how unfair the judgments do come down when some, white people who have been convicted of crimes are given lesser sentences than people of color. And we've seen that recently. There's been like a lot of controversy around Amber Geiger, in Texas, getting a 10-year sentence for her crime of murder. And also with Felicity Huffman, who is now serving her 2-week sentence for the scandal with the college admissions, and the other Black woman who got 5 years for voting by accident, didn't know she wasn't eligible to vote. Right. And those sentences seem very drastic, very, very different. And I think that, again, representation plays a big part in that.
It does. And I think the issue of representation is like there's like a multiple ways that you could look at it. So, I mean, in the election process, in the campaign process, if you're a candidate to become a judge, there's a lot of payments that have to be made. People buy endorsements. It's a requirement in some places for you to get endorsed by, in some cases, the Democratic Party. They request a donation, right? And those donations can be a lot of money for for Black and brown folks who have less access to cash. But also, too, what a major issue is like the way in which ballot positions are selected. So candidates will go up to Harrisburg and they'll just select out of a can a number, and then that number will represent your ballot position. And we know that whatever ballot position you have, if it's like closer to 1 or it's closer to the front of the ballot, then you are more likely to be elected. And it plays out every single year because, one, there's not a lot of attention that's being put on the judicial elections, and how that it can lead to disparate impact of one person being sentenced to 2 weeks in jail for buying her child's entrance into college, and another woman being sentenced to 5 or 10 years in jail for sending her child to live with her father so that they can go to a better school. These things happen in the same country but in different places, which really highlights the fact that we have the opportunity to control what that looks like in Philadelphia, and hold our judges accountable because we elect our judges. So the recent news articles about Judge Brinkley and her sentencing a man who was unable to pay for court fees to, I think a few months in jail. I believe he's in jail as it stands. And that's just completely unacceptable. You're criminalizing poverty. And in reality, the whole social contract, the reason why we give, supposedly, us, the community, us, the people, give the government so much power is so that they can watch over the community and ensure that we have access to resources, that we have the things that we need in order for us to thrive within society. And so the idea of a judge looking at someone who is unable to afford $1,400, $1,900 in court fees, and saying, okay, well, I want to make an example of you. My question is, well, who are you trying to make an example of? And like, who's your audience for this example? Because if it's poor people, life is hard enough. We don't need for the criminal justice system to criminalize our poverty. And I think that on Judge Brinkley's behalf, that it was a misstep and indicative of a larger pattern of behavior that I think I would really like the public to have full access to, that history and what her record is.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about that, which is getting feedback from the public, right, about their experience with judges. There is a judge right now who could be facing trial for ethics violations, Judge Lyris F. Younge, and she was in family court. And my understanding is that many people who were in front of her in court were able to vocalize their experience with her. And there have been various allegations, but people in general felt they were treated unfairly. They felt a lack of compassion, a lack of respect there. And they really feel that, the outcome of their cases was really affected by this particular judge and her attitudes towards the people in her court. And so now she's going to be held accountable for those allegations. So we'll see what happens with that. But I think it's important that people talk about it, right? Because if only one person says it, it doesn't go very far. But if you have dozens of people who are experiencing the same thing, then you can sort of make a change and you have a stronger case to hold that judge accountable and to really question whether or not they deserve to be in that position of power. And so you have some mechanisms in place, right, to talk to the public, which is all of you who are listening and watching, with your experience with judges.
Yeah, I mean, so we have a hotline and an email address. So our hotline is 267-289-2539. And the email address is phillyjudgewatch@gmail.com. And what that is absence of any reports showing us like patterns in behavior that show that they prefer over incarceration, and that they have an issue with their misdemeanor or their demeanor while on the bench. In the absence of that report, we're going straight to the community. We're going straight to the defense attorneys. We're going straight to the public defenders and anyone who advocates or represents a defendant in the courtroom, to talk to us about your experiences with those judges. Talk to us about those egregious cases. Let us know, because that's the only way the community has of holding these judges accountable. And the judge accountability table's job is not to actually make a determination of whether or not any judge should be retained or not, but we're going to give the people who are invested in the decarceration of Philadelphia and the reduction of our prison population, we're going to give those responsive voters the information that they need to make the decisions about the judges in real time.
Right. So if you go to their Facebook page, it's facebook.com/judgeyourjudges, which is pretty easy to remember. They have a list. We won't read all the lists of judges. We'll put them on blast. But they are judges from the Court of Common Pleas and Municipal Court. And again, the idea is for people to give feedback on their experience with those judges. I would say good or bad, right? Because if there's good judges, then, we need to know that too.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, it's easy to just talk about the bad things, but with the good judges, we really need to uplift our good judges. We need to make an example of, need to make them an example for the rest of the First Judicial District of how we expect our judges to act. And then they could also be partners in helping us to identify ways in which we can help the communities, because a lot of times they see community members when they're at their worst or it's a really bad day. And I think judges have a good insight on some of the issues that are going on in communities, but they also need to have the temperament and the will to use their discretion to make the communities that these people are coming from a better place. And oftentimes saddling community members with large prison sentences, large probation sentences, and large fines is siphoning resources out of those communities in the form of humans and, financial resources.
And I would say that this, looking at the coalition, right, that this is just like one kind of like small piece to overall like criminal justice reform. Yes. And we want to give a quick shout out to all these organizations, Reclaim Philly, Project Safe, 215 People's Alliance, Philadelphia Community Bail Fund, YASP, which is the Youth Art Self-Empowerment Project, the Amistad Law Project, Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration, ICE Out of Courts, Decarcerate PA. I mean, there's so many. I'm only mentioning a few. But again, all of these organizations in their various forms are all working on decarceration just in general, right? Criminal justice reform, and information that's like more accessible to the community, because it is, whether it's a civil or criminal case, it's a really tough system to navigate, especially when you don't have the financial resources, you may not have the education or literacy level, and just like the overall like family or, community support to get through all of that. It could be really easy to give up. And so I just want to thank all of you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I want to throw Black Lives Matter Philly in there as well.
Yes.
And also in regards to community input within the courtroom, just want to lift up the participatory defense hubs. You can just Google that if you want to learn more about it, but it's basically empowering communities to show judges during their court cases what the defendants mean to them in a way of changing the outcomes of cases. And they've had a lot of time that they've saved people from jail attributed to the organizing that they're doing throughout the hubs in Philadelphia.
Yeah, just on a side note, organizers from the participatory defense hubs came on Looking Forward Reentry Radio, and I was surprised that one of the main organizers is a mother whose son was shot and killed, and she is channeling all of her grief and all of her energy towards this very beautiful project. I was really just so inspired by the work that those mothers are doing. And so again, anybody can get involved in this. So another great resource that we like to tell people about is the Committee of 70. It's an organization here in Philly that will help you navigate the ballot. There are judges up for election this November. Some of the other seats, again, City Council, they make the laws, right? So if we want to decriminalize things, we have to look into City Council candidates that are down with decriminalization. County Sheriff, Register of Wills, City Commissioner, and a ton of judicial candidates for Commonwealth Court, Superior Court, Court of Common Pleas, and municipal court judges. So again, if you'd like to see who the candidates are for your district, you can go onto their website, 70.org, look them up. Also, the Bar Association gives a ranking, gives endorsements, kind of gives a thumbs up, thumbs down. We interviewed them, so you can find our video on that on YouTube at Philly Cam's channel. But super important to know who you're voting for when you get in there, and there's tons of information out there. So give them the phone number and the email address one more time.
Of course. So the phone number is 267-289-2539. You can leave a message and also indicate if you'd like to get a call back. And then also you can send us an email at phillyjudgewatch@gmail.com.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Devron Washington, and he is an organizer with the Judge Accountability Table, working to make our criminal justice system more fair, more equitable, and trying to decarcerate Pennsylvania. Stay tuned. Up next, we will be talking with some organizers from Protect Our Vote Philly. We're going to be talking about the upcoming election and these new voting machines and so much more. Don't miss it on this edition of the People Power Lunch Hour Show. We'll be right back.
The general elections are on November 5th, and if you're a college student, in the military, are ill, or if there are any other reasons why you are unable to vote in person, absentee ballots are always an option many people are unaware of. Here at PhillyCam, we will give you all you need to know on absentee ballots for this upcoming election. You can fill out an application for an absentee ballot online, by mail, or in person at your county election office. Applications must be received by October 29, 2019 to be used for the November 5th election. There are even alternative language applications in Spanish, Chinese, and Vietnamese. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania does not have early voting. Absentee ballots are a great alternative if you aren't able to make it in person on November 5th for the general elections, or for any future elections. And whether you vote in person or send in your absentee ballot, don't forget to vote this election.
Hello and welcome back to the People Power Lunch Hour Show. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber. And on this month's episodes of the People Power Lunch Hour Show, we are going to be talking about voting and elections. I want to thank Devron Washington for coming and talking about the Judge Accountability Table in the first half hour. And in the second half hour, I have two organizers from Protect Our Vote Philly. They're a coalition working to bring accurate, accessible, and secure voting systems at a fair cost to Philadelphia, and a watchdog over the Office of City Commissioners, which operates Philadelphia's elections. They believe the gold standard for election integrity is hand-marked paper ballots, the best possible accessibility devices, and mandatory risk-limiting audits after every election. I want to welcome to the show two organizers from Protect Our Vote Philly, Scott McCarthy and Murille McCarthy. Welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about Protect Our Vote Philly and some of the work that you have been doing, especially in regards to the upcoming election and these new voting machines that have been unveiled by the city.
Happy to do that. Thanks for having us. Protect Our Vote Philly started last year when citizens realized that the Board of Elections wasn't asking the public for their input about selecting the new machines. Citizens and organizers from different organizations decided to form a coalition. So voters, taxpayers, and these organizations are now, as you said, the watchdog by default of the Board of Elections. We've been advocating, as you said, for a safe, auditable, verifiable system and that can be audited. And unfortunately, the city decided to select a system that doesn't offer those things and paid a premium for those things that don't even work. Regarding the November election, we've been advocating for a better system all these months, so about 8-9 months. Attending Board of Elections meetings and putting forth information to the members to let them know why there's a problem with these machines. There's multiple reasons that we're concerned. And they chose to continue with this contract anyway. So November, we'll be using this voting system because even though Controller Reinhardt's investigation found massive problems with the procurement process, she didn't find that the vendor had created any problems that could justify her withholding funding for the contract. So we are on for November. Despite that, we are still advocating for a safer system. A safer system, we believe, as you said, is a hand-marked paper ballot system that would cost $11 million or so. That's what the vendor quoted us. It's the exact same vendor that sold us this problematic system. We have time to get a new system. We've been talking to the public, informing them, talking to legislators, informing them. Many of these people are very concerned about the system that we are going to have in November. But we don't have enough time to turn that around, despite all our efforts.
Interesting. The governor, put out a mandate to every county in Pennsylvania to review and upgrade their voting systems. And he had two standards. He said it should be voter verifiable and it should be auditable. And, as Murielle's indicating, those standards are not being met here in Philadelphia. The Board of Elections has chosen a machine that prints out a ballot card that has a barcode on it. And the barcode is what you can see, underneath a window in the machine. And that is what then goes back through the machine and what is ultimately counted by the machine to tally up votes. None of us can read a barcode. We've never met anybody that can read a barcode. So when you look at this ballot card in the machine, and it prints out a name that is meant to indicate who you're voting for, but what's being counted is the barcode that's on that ballot card. And the voter cannot look at the barcode and verify that's what their intent is. So this machine fails that requirement that the governor set up. And then in addition, there's the requirement that the system is auditable. And because you have this ballot card that then goes back through the machine and goes back under a printhead in the machine and is therefore subject to being tampered with when it goes back through the machine and under the printhead, you have is a very low quality standard of auditability. And I know that's very technical in a way, and but this is really important for protecting votes and for being able to safeguard everybody's right to vote and their intention when they vote. So this is really an unacceptable standard with regard to being able to go back and audit the vote. You cannot look to a separate document that's independent from what the machine is producing to say this is what the voter intended. So the machine fails on both standards that the governor required of Pennsylvania counties.
Yeah, I just want to back up for a second because that's all really great information, but it's sort of looking forward. And I'd like to look back for a second at some of the problems we've had with the last few elections, right? There's been plenty of controversy around whether or not the ballots have been counted correctly, whether or not the machine selected the right candidates for folks, especially in a place like Georgia, where they had a very tight election and there was claims of voter suppression. And even as far back as the presidential election with President Bush and Vice President Gore, I teach at Temple University, and we were watching a film that talked about these, fraudulent elections in Latin America. And I said, that's happened here in the United States. And they were like, really? Like, when has that happened? And I was like, wow, it happens at many different levels, local level, state level, and even as far as the presidency. And they didn't really know too much about that. So I'd like to tell our listeners and viewers about some of the cases that we've seen, and especially with presidential candidate Jill Stein, who also had a whole lawsuit around, these types of problems in the elections.
So Jill Stein actually is back in the picture because she had challenged the Department of State, saying that her presidential bid for the presidency was not verifiable because we didn't have a paper trail with our machines. So the governor mandated that we have a paper trail that can be verified and audited. However, because this machine doesn't actually meet the settlement agreement with the Stein campaign, she has submitted a letter to the Department of State requesting that they decertify the system. She submitted that October 1st. That was the event that you mentioned earlier. And the Department of State has 30 days, the PA Department of State has 30 days to decertify the system, which is highly unlikely because they had an opportunity to decertify it before and they chose not to. And so it's likely that in November, Jill Stein she plans to go to federal court, and it'll probably be in November. So that means that the machines that we use in April may or may not be the Express Vote XL. This is the machine that the city has chosen. There have been problems in other states. The Mueller report has revealed that voter registration systems have been hacked. We know that Georgia's trying to get hand-marked paper ballots. There's issues with electronic voting machines, according to security experts throughout the country, who, with no exception, they say that the hand-marked paper ballot system is the safest system because it removes so many of the computer elements out of the equation.
No, I just agree. I would just echo those comments. The Senate Select Committee findings, were really disturbing and really concerning. And then, it just seems like every week, we see a news story about some data system that we all rely on, to be, and that we all expect to be secure and maintain the privacy of our personal information is being breached. And these machines, have many points of entry, if you will, electronically. They have to be updated for every vote. They have to be updated when there's a system update.
Every
that's
race.
that's every rate.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Thank you. This it's a computer, and so it needs a system update. We see that all the time on our cell phones or on our laptops, right? And so this computer is no different. So there are these multiple points of entry, if you will, electronically for bad actors to get into the system. And then because it has such a poor audit trail, such an inadequate audit trail, then how do you know what might have occurred? You can't, if you're concerned about the results, if the results seem off for whatever reason, how do you go back and really know for sure that you were able to recount the voters' intent, recapture their intent?
Yeah, I mean, we have several things going on, right? Because Pennsylvania isn't the most voter-friendly state, right? We don't have same-day registration. We have closed primaries. And there's certainly advocates who are trying to make voting in itself more accessible. But then once you get to the polls, you get to the election booth, the voting booth, your vote may or may not be counted. You may or may not select the person that you intend to select, right? We've seen that you press one, but then it selects another. What can people do? Because we have an election in a couple weeks. How's your organization engaging with the community? It doesn't look like the city's gonna do anything about these voting machines, at least not yet. So what recourse does the public have, and how can they engage with your organization?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. We're at povphilly.org, where we have all our extensive documentation, our updates, videos of the Board of Elections meetings. People can read a ton of information to their heart's content. We have extremely solid documentation of all our claims. For November, my husband Scott suggested that people have an absentee ballot, because that you're handwriting it, it's going to get scanned, and assuming the chain of custody is handled properly, that nobody throws your ballot in the trash.
Let's say that one more time to your audience. We recommend you get an absentee ballot for any election that's going to use this machine.
We are personally saying that.
Yeah.
I don't know that POV has that
Fair
stand,
enough.
to be
fair. Fair enough, but that is a hand-marked paper ballot. And you will know that your vote is being properly counted and is safe and secure.
And you talked about the Board of Elections meetings. Like, how important is it for people to participate and also show up at meetings like that where these important issues are being discussed?
It's very important. POV's done a great job documenting every single Board of Elections meeting, videotaping it, and what we've noticed is that the Board of Elections members don't follow the Sunshine Act. They're supposed to convene their dialogues in public. Sometimes they have executive meetings and then don't talk about what they talked about. So we are doing a good job of calling them out on that. It's a great opportunity for concerned citizens to make a 2 to 3 minute statement. Sometimes they let you go longer. To voice our concerns. But frankly, they have been very unresponsive. They are allowed to engage with the public, and they choose not to. So we ask them questions during our public comment time. We have reasons to ask certain questions, and they don't answer. Previous boards have had back and forth with the public, and they choose not to. So it's a secretive board. We don't really know who's in charge of the Board of Elections. As you know, Commissioners Deely and Commissioners Schmidt had to recuse themselves because they were candidates. But as Controller Reinhardt's report that came out a couple weeks ago revealed, and we already understood, those commissioners were candidates when they voted for this system. So that should right there invalidate the contract. And it hasn't. And we have to wonder, why isn't the city more meticulous about doing business in a professional way?
I would just go back. That's all great. And I would just go back to your earlier question about how to engage with the public and what can people be thinking about doing. One of the things that we've been doing is getting meetings with city council members, state representatives, state senators, and we find that in every one of those meetings that we sit down and we get a general initial impression from those folks that this system is okay. That's what they're hearing. And we say, well, there's a lot of information that you might not yet be privy to, that you might not be aware of, and it's all that information that's available, at the POV Philly website. And so when we inform them about what they're not being told, we find that in virtually every one of those meetings, by the end of that meeting, they're asking us, well, what can I do? Who do I need to call? Who should I write to? So we would encourage the public to reach out to their city council rep, to reach out to their state representative, their state senator, and let them know that they're concerned about these machines. Because when we meet with them and talk to them, by the end of that meeting, those folks are concerned about these machines and the safety and security of our voting system.
We also asked legislators to contact Acting Secretary of State Bookvar, who's in charge of certifying the system, to let her know that this system is not good enough for us. We're 1 million people. We're 12% of the state's vote. We're in a swing state. There's a lot at stake in 2020. We need a better system in April. We are not responsible for the fact that the city decided to spend $30 million on the worst system that's available, according to security experts. So we demand that we have a better system in April.
And we can get one.
While we still have time.
Yeah, and I was going to say, have you looked at other places where there are good alternatives? Are there cities or states that do have options that we can look to?
It's the hand-marked paper ballot is used across the state. It's used across the country. It's something like 60 to 70% of voters in the U.S. use a hand-marked paper ballot. In Pennsylvania, I think it's 24 of 31 counties that use a hand-marked paper ballot. Major cities like Philadelphia, whether it's Boston, New York, Chicago, Miami, they all use a hand-marked paper ballot. So that system is tried and true. It's tested. It works. There's no controversy whatsoever around a hand-marked paper ballot. And it costs something like half the cost of what this system would cost. So it's available. It can be implemented in a short period of time, certainly by the April primaries. Obviously, it's this November election's a foregone conclusion with what machine we have to use, but we can get a hand-marked paper ballot system in place. It's available from the same vendor that Philadelphia is buying this ExpressVote XL machine from. It's available from other vendors. It's used on a widespread basis for plenty of time, here in Pennsylvania and again across the U.S. So
and the entire state of Colorado has decided to use hand-marked paper ballots.
Yeah, and Pennsylvania being, a sort of like swing state plays a really critical role in the presidential election. So it's even more important that all the votes are counted properly, especially with the primaries, which is going to be pretty close, right? There's a lot riding on that election. But I think that, if we can't get it done for November, it's definitely looking at 2020, right? It's
absolutely
to make those really critical improvements.
I think you hit on a really important point there. It's these very tight elections that appear to be coming down the road, particularly around this the presidential primary and the general election next year. Those are elections that can be contested and that people can demand a recount. And you're going to have this horrible record, this ballot card and all of the questions around that ballot card and the security of that ballot card, and no proven method to audit that vote. These machines really have never been used. I think there's something like maybe 70,000 voters in the U.S. that have used these machines once or twice. This is an unproven voting machine
Based on 2005 standards, very old technology.
So nobody really knows how to work through a process of a contested vote.
Presidential election.
Yeah, so this is a
scary stuff.
And it was pretty divisive and very disconcerting. Like when the election was challenged in 2000, and they literally had to recount the votes, right? The ballots in Florida, and what a mess that was, and showed a lot of vulnerabilities in that system. And to think that we haven't made that much improvement since then.
You remember they were holding all those cards and looking at those silly chads and all that craziness, right? Imagine that they take this ballot card and they're holding up the barcode and telling us, well, let's see, is that the barcode for candidate X or candidate Y? I mean, it's crazy.
The Department of State has said that it knows that the design flaw exists, where after the voter sees the printed card, that the card goes back under the print head, and says that's okay because the voter, the printer is detectable and auditable. So that means that a voter is supposed to know that the sound that they're hearing from the machine is normal, or it's the printer activating and doing something to their ballot card, and supposed to tell a poll worker, excuse me, but I think something's going wrong with my vote. And we've got a million people. There's no way that we can be the watchdog to make sure that something doesn't get printed on our card. It's an absurd workaround.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Department of State agrees that there's a problem with this machine and says that's okay. In a noisy, crowded polling station, the voter will be able to detect that something's happening. You can't make this stuff up.
We hear a lot of crazy stuff on People Power Lunch Hour Show. But that's the whole point, right? Is to like raise awareness and let people know of these practices and how they can get involved. And as you mentioned earlier, contacting your local representatives, letting them know how you feel about these new voting machines is really important. Ways that you can, have your vote counted using absentee ballots, like that's one of the ways. But I think, again, like looking towards 2020 and getting involved with groups like yours and others who are advocating that for these changes is also really important. I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. And this isn't like the most like exciting, like sexy type of organizing, but it's really critical to maintaining our democracy and making sure that our voices are heard. And so it's very important. And I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. Can you tell people one more time how they can find you online or through social media?
Sure. It's Protect Our Vote Philly. So it's povphilly.org.
And you can find information about the voting machines, the Jill Stein case, and more on their website and on social media. And so, yes, definitely look up all this information ahead of the November elections. It's really important to know what you're getting into at your polling place, so there's no surprises. And again, we want to shout out Committee of 70, 70.org, where you can look and see what's on the ballot and make sure you do your research. And again, I want to thank the folks at the Judge Accountability Table working to raise awareness about our elected officials in the courts. So thanks again, Murille McCarthy and Scott McCarthy from Protect Our Vote Philly. I'm Vanessa Maria Graber for People Power Lunch Hour Show. That's going to do it for this episode. We're going to continue with our theme of voting and elections throughout the month. You can watch this episode and all of our episodes of the People Power Lunch Hour Show at phillycam.org. You can also follow us on YouTube at our PhillyCam page. Thanks so much for watching and listening.